Club. Washington Journal continues.
On Wednesdays on the Washington Journal, we take a look at a recent magazine article. It's part of our Spotlight on Magazine series. And today we want to go online to the Atlantic's web, their Atlantic Wire service, to look at this piece by Philip Bump. Does more campaign money actually buy more votes? An investigation. Mr. Bump joining us from New York this morning. So let's answer the question here. Does it?
There is a correlation, which I expect won't surprise a lot of people. But yes, we took a look at the 435 House races in 2012 using data from the Center for Responsive Politics, which runs Open Secrets, as well as the final vote tallies in each of those races. And we found that there was a correlation between the amount of money that was spent and the vote total by which the person won.
When you look inside your piece, Philip Bump, there are these charts with blue dots and red lines.
Right.
Can you explain this, this first one? The red dotted line is the most important part of this graphic. It shows the trend in all of the data. Explain what happened here, what you're looking at.
Sure. So what you're looking at when you look at that graph is it is two axes. One axis is the margin of victory in the race, the number of actual votes that the winner had over the person that came in second, compared to the amount they spent per vote. So one of the measures you can use to gauge the amount of money that was spent is comparing the total sum of spending and divide it by the number of votes, and it gives you a cost per vote. So in 2012, for example, on average, winning Congress members spent $9.84 for each vote that they got. So what that graph actually shows is that as races became closer, once you got into races that were within a margin of 5 percentage points or 10 percentage points for the winner, that the votes became more costly. In other words, they spent more money per vote in closer races.
And what if the vote cost less? What was then the result?
Well, again, this is just a correlation. There are a lot of factors and a lot of caveats that go into place here. But in general, in races, if you spent less money, then you were less likely to win. So the next set of graphs down shows that there's a correlation between the extent to which you outspent your opponent and your margin of victory. And what we found is there's a correlation there. The more you outspent your opponent, the more likely you were to win the race. And in races where the person won by 20 percentage points or less, that effect was amplified. So in other words, in closer races, the more you outspent your opponent, the more likely you were to win.
And what if you were an incumbent? Does that factor into this?
We took a look at that as well. For the most part, the incumbents usually win. So just looking at incumbents wouldn't have been terribly different than the rest of the data pool. But what we looked at is we looked at the races in which the incumbent didn't win, in which the challenger actually was able to win the race. And what we found is that those challengers, almost all of them, also outraised the incumbent. And there's a difference there between the spending, how much the candidate actually spends on the race, and how much they raise for it. But we looked at what was raised in the case of the incumbents because we figured that might be a better measure of energy and the amount of work that the candidate had put in to the race. And so, again, there's that correlation. The more they raised, the more likely they were to win.
So what if you were in a tight race?
Again, the same effect. I mean, I don't mean to sound like a broken record here, but the relationship was between more money, more victory, more money, more votes. Which is sort of what we assume, right? And this is what we wanted to do, is look and see if there actually existed this correlation that we all sort of take for granted. And there is, and it is not necessarily as strong as people assume, but it exists.
So
it is worth saying that. Just go ahead.
So what does all that mean then by saying, okay, here's the data?
Sure.
It seems like an obvious question. Yes, more campaign cash will get you more votes. So, but having the data to prove that, what do you think that means?
I think it means that, that's honestly a very good question. I mean, there are different meanings that different people can take from it, right? I think what it means is that, yes, the conventional wisdom that there is a relationship between how much money campaigns have and the likelihood of victory, something which people have assumed, and honestly political scientists have said, yes, this is the case, that correlation exists. It is demonstrated in 2012 that even in this presidential year in which turnout is higher and one might expect there to be something, more instability in what's happening, it existed. But again, this doesn't take into effect things like outside spending. So, for example, the data that the Center for Responsive Politics uses is actual FEC filing data. It is how much campaigns themselves raised. It does not include super PACs. It does not include 527s. It does not include any of the external independent expenditures that go into political campaigns. And then, of course, there are a whole slew of other factors at play in any particular race. If the candidate has some terrible gaffe, if there's a scandal that emerges, none of that stuff is accounted for in this calculation. This is just purely what the campaign raised versus the vote totals.
Well, let's talk a little bit about outside spending and the election results from this off-year election in 2013. Open Secrets categorizes it by 2014 spending, but look at Michael Bloomberg. Liberal causes spent $2.3 million so far for 2014. Thomas Steyer, $1.8 million, also for liberal causes. On the conservative side, Thomas and Sally Jordan, $1.4 million, and Robert Perry, $1.1 million. But Michael Bloomberg, in the 2013 elections, lost some races that he dumped a lot of money into.
Sure. Well, I mean, it is categorically the case that money can't buy elections, right? And I know that what I just said in terms of there being a correlation between the amount you spend and your ability to win a race, that exists. I realize it sounds contradictory. But there are multiple factors that come into play. The first thing is that Bloomberg and other big spenders that come into a race usually have to do so, it depends on what kind of race it is and where it happens to be, but have to do so without coordinating with the campaign by law. That is the standard that applies. And so that means that there may be a doubling of efforts. It may mean that the strategy that's employed isn't as effective. I mean, most of these political campaigns are run by political parties or are run by folks that have done a lot of campaigns in the past. In my personal experience, it has been the case that people who are wealthy and who want to run a political campaign sometimes don't, they have a new way of running a race, or, there are various factors that come into play that may mean that they are less experienced at doing political campaigns, and that may affect the outcome. I'm not saying that's the case here, but the case of Tom Steyer, that was actually the day that we did our analysis was the day that Politico had a big report about how much Steyer had spent on the gubernatorial race in Virginia. And we took a quick look at the data, and honestly, this is something that, Mr. Steyer's people have and will spend a lot more time in analyzing. But we took a quick look at the data and where they said they targeted, and frankly, there was not a big shift in those locations compared to some of the other places in the state. So was his spending effective? Obviously Terry McAuliffe won by a very small margin, and in cases like that, a lot of little things can make a big difference. But was it Tom Steyer that made the difference in Virginia? It's very hard to say given the number of variables at play.
What is the best way? Does it matter how you spend your money? If so, what is the best way to spend the money? You're asking me to tread into very, very tricky territory among people who run political campaigns. I have in the past run political campaigns. I did a lot of work on the field, which is the actual door-knocking, canvassing, telephone call. So I'm a little partial to field as being something that's effective in political races, although it only makes a small difference. There was a lot of hullabaloo earlier this year when Bill de Blasio, who recently won the mayor's race in New York City during the Democratic primary, didn't send a lot of direct mail, which usually is one of the tactics that candidates use because it allows them to target very specific people. You can target by very specific demographic information, very specific location information, but de Blasio didn't do that. Of course, he was also romping in his race. He had a lot of TV ads and spent a lot of money there. So the short answer is it depends on the race. And the longer answer is a lot of ways are good, but I personally think field is great. Well, Sea of Tranquility tweets in on that. Does he have any data looking at the effectiveness of money spent, and how is that measured? Because you said, field operations only account for a few percentage points?
That's right. Yeah, in general. I mean, that's sort of a rule of thumb. And one of the interesting things about political races is that it is not usually campaigns themselves that want to go back and do a lot of analysis about what actually worked and what actually didn't. Usually when a candidate wins, the day after, great, the campaign's over, let's not worry about that for another 2 to 4 years, right? Political parties spend a lot more time on this. Academics spend a lot of time on this as well. So where is money best spent? I think that also differs depending on what kind of race it is. If it is a local race, for example, you may spend more time on field because you have a smaller area to cover. You can make more of an effect. If it's a statewide race like a ballot proposition in California, TV ads may be the best way to spend money because you can reach more people, and that you're going to stay in the geographic area. Like, I live in New York City. I think a lot of people here saw ads over the course of the past month for the New Jersey governor's race, which they have to spend that money because they are, in their local TV news area covers part of New York City, but it's a waste of money. Like, I don't need to see an ad for Chris Christie, right? I mean, I can't vote for Chris Christie, so there's no point in showing it to me. So that's a waste of money, but you don't really have a choice. So again, it sounds kind of like a hedge, but it depends on the situation.
Well, another tweet here from a viewer, though, who wants to know, does it matter when you spend your money? Time the money you spend and winning percentage. Spend it all at the end or the start of the race?
Sure, it's a good question. We did not look at that. I think that this, again, has different schools of thought, although in general you want to do it closer to Election Day primarily because that's when people are paying attention. I think that, me sitting here, you, probably the people that are watching the show, pay closer attention to politics than most people do. Most people pay attention to politics around Election Day, don't spend a lot of time beforehand. And so it's a question of whether or not if you do a TV ad 2 months beforehand, send them mail, yes, you'll probably be the only message they hear, but the question is, will they remember it 2 months later?
All right, Jack in Texas, independent caller. Thanks for hanging on the line, Jack. We're talking with Atlantic Wire's Philip Bump about his piece for The Atlantic Online about campaign cash and winning results. Go ahead.
Okay, good. Thank you. Hey, Shay, you talk about the money being wasted in an election where it was won. I'm a little out of breath. Look, all the money spent in the campaign, no matter what it goes to support the media. The media is part of the system which supports each other. One hand washes the other. There is never any dollar spent in a campaign that protects the vested interest, which is wasted. Not one. You talk about Bloomberg, spent all that money. My God, he owns half of the media in New York City.
All right, Philip Bump, I mean, the role of media, but also
Sure.
the importance of using media to win an election.
Right. Well, I mean, I think there's a valid point. Local news stations make a lot of money during election years. They do. I mean, there's no way to dispute that. They make a lot of money selling ads. Normally, an ad in late October would sell for X amount. During an election year, it sells for 2 times, 3 times that amount. Yes, there is that's a valid point, that the media makes money from political campaigns. That's true. However, there are a lot of aspects of the political campaigns that don't actually touch the media. There are times that political campaigns try and get free media, earned media, where they have events and hope that the news shows up. But they do a lot of direct mail. They do a lot of online advertising. They do a lot of, field campaign, right? They hire people or they get volunteers to go and knock on doors, and they print little flyers that get handed out. So I think that the idea that the media and political campaigns are living in a symbiotic relationship isn't the case. Yes, there's a benefit to the media, but it is not the case that the media tries to, blow politics out of proportion just to get more money out of it.
Gary on Twitter tweets in about this, saying, isn't media the biggest benefactor of campaign spending? Media will never get behind any effort to limit campaign season and spending. Milton in Vineland, New Jersey, Democratic caller.
Hi, good morning, Greta. Good morning, Philip. Philip, I wanted to get your opinion, just if I may, just make 2 quick points. One is you seem to be very astute with politics, and obviously you've been following it for a long time. Tell me what you think about in terms of the Supreme Court or whichever court it was that said that money or powerful corporations or money is also speech, right, and how that figures into your conversation today. And if I then might ask you, and please bear with me on this a little bit, Greta, I'm not trying to go backwards, but I want Philip to also, because I know he's obviously studied politics very well over the years, when did it become so amazing that a politician would or should or could or even tells a lie? Where in history, in your opinion, where there's been no politician literally to tell no lie? And I only make that point is because they're saying that this president lied. And then the question would be, how many hundreds of thousands of civilians have died since President Barack Obama, quote-unquote, told this lie, if you want your health care, you can keep it? I'm just talking about from a political point of view, from a person who studied politics.
Okay, we'll leave it there, Milton. Philip Bump.
Sure. So to your first point, the question of the extent to which the media gets money from corporations, in particular following the Citizens United decision. You know, I mean, this goes to your point about Bloomberg and Tom Steyer and some of the other external spending. It is that is not exactly the same sort of spending, but it is in effect the same thing. That political campaigns can receive money from corporations, that corporations can actually invest in political races and try and affect the outcome. And there are differing schools of thought. Some people feel as though this has already had a significant effect on how political campaigns have been run. Some people feel as though it's been a dud, nothing's actually happened with it yet. I think time will tell. I think people are still starting to explore that space, and we'll see how that actually shifts things, or if it does. To your second point, I wrote a piece during the campaign last year, the point of which was that political candidates say what they think people want to hear in order to get their vote. The definition of lie is a philosophical question, which we can leave to people at universities to some extent. But you know, beyond that, I think that politicians are very adept at framing a message in a way that people will respond to. Whether or not that always constitutes a lie is, I think, subjective.
Michael Korn on Twitter weighs in on this United Citizens part of the conversation. Does this mean that Citizens United ruling is accelerating the end of democracy? Upper classes continue to manage the system. We'll go to Kyle in California, San Francisco, Republican caller. Hi, Kyle.
Hi, good morning, and thanks for taking my call. While we're on the subject of Citizens United, I've been noticing in the last couple races, particularly the Virginia governor's race, that we're routinely seeing headlines and data that are showing that the Democrat Party super PACs seem to be outspending the Republican super PACs. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on sort of the irony of that, because just a couple years ago, even in 2012, Democrats were saying things like super PACs are bad, it was the worst decision ever, a lot of hyperbole. And a lot of commentary that I've heard since then, you know, there's been, in my opinion, limited media coverage of this. And I've heard, you know, some people say things like, well, this is just a new reality, we have to adapt to it. But they're not only adapting to that new reality that they called so bad years ago, they're doing it in quite a much larger number than Republicans in terms of funds. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, sort of the politics of that.
Okay. All right, Kyle, before Philip answers that, I just want to show our viewers Open Secret's website. And it shows the top PAC recipients for 2014. House candidates, Eric Cantor getting the most from PACs on the House side. On the Senate side, Mark Pryor, Democrat from Arkansas, who's up for re-election. Then you can see the list from there. Mitch McConnell, John Cornyn, Tim Scott, Mary Landrieu, Kay Hagan, Ed Markey, etc. And then on the House side, Dave Camp, Kevin McCarthy, Steny Hoyer, John Boehner, Bill Schuster, Fred Upton, etc.
Right. It's largely leaders and people who are in tight races. You know, and then in the Open Secret site, that PAC money includes, for example, candidate PACs. So that's not necessarily strictly external money. To the point around Citizens United, I think that we have this tendency to assume that we will see all negative and positive effects instantaneously. I think the Citizens United ruling is going to be something that echoes over time. I think that it will continue to evolve. I think that we can expect further rulings from the Supreme Court about it, as well as potentially something coming out of Congress, although I don't think there's any traction on that at this point. So we will see. I've seen the reports, as you have, that say that the Democrats outspent, or I should say, Democratic-leaning super PACs outspent the Republicans over the course of the last election cycle, and I think that's interesting as well. But I also think that beyond the super PACs, beyond Citizens United, there have always been ways and legal loopholes and ways in which people have tried to invest and affect political campaigns. And I think that the vehicle under which that happens has shifted a little bit, but I think that the process remains largely the same, that people who want to affect a political race and have the money to do so will figure out a way legally to do so.
We're talking about campaign cash and whether or not it brings you more votes with Philip Bump of the Atlantic Wire. As we go to the next call, I want to show you from Open Secret's website the most expensive races in the Senate. Take a look at money raised and money spent, and you can see some of the most contested Senate races being some of the most expensive. Let's go to Chuck in Hamburg, New York. Independent caller.
Yeah, I think in this modern day of electronics that we have now, do I have to watch 12 commercials during a TV half-hour news at night? Can't we come up with something better than this? If half of this money that we donate, people, corporations, everybody donate to these politicians, we could actually pay off our national debt. We could take care of a lot of our problems. We could have less influence, because that's all money does is corrupt and buy influence. It's a sad world we're living in right now. It really is sad, and I think if people don't wake up to the fact that they're getting messed over every day by our government, the people that we put in there.
Mr. Bump.
Well, I think the church bells in the background of that call has some sort of significance. I'm not sure what. You know, I mean, I think that the slew of ads, political ads, that you'll hear shortly before a campaign, before Election Day on local TV, everyone agrees that's annoying. There's no, you know, I mean, again, I was watching ads for both gubernatorial candidates in New Jersey when I was watching TV in late October. It doesn't make any sense. And you know, oftentimes when you work on a political campaign, you'll hear from people. People will call in and say, if I see your ad one more time, I'm not voting for you. If I get one more piece of mail from you, I'm not voting for you. And no one ever takes it seriously, because they, you know, honestly, the odds that that person then doesn't actually vote for a candidate if they support them are fairly slim. But there's honestly not a lot you can do about it, right? I mean, this is the market in which we live. We live in a capitalist world. We live in a world in which the media says, hey, we have this thing that we will sell you and you can reach X number of people, and in which political campaigns want to reach X number of people. So yes, it is annoying. I don't know that money is necessarily corruptive influence over everything. I don't know the extent to which money corrupts everyone in Congress, which I think is also the sort of the standard. You know, Congress's approval, according to Gallup, is 9%, and that's one of the factors. People think that everyone in Congress is not representing their constituents because they're out chasing dollars or whatever it is. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but it is absolutely the case, and I can say with objectivity that a lot of campaign ads can be annoying.
We'll go to James, Springfield, Missouri, independent caller.
Hello, I'm James from Missouri. Thank you for holding this important program. I have a question. Has anyone done an impact study about allowing the airwaves to be given access to the candidates for a small period of time before the elections? We often hear that the American people own the airwaves, the free speech. One of the 4 freedoms of FDR is the free speech. And I think this would take the money from driving politics into allowing the merits of the case or the legislative agenda to determine who gets the votes instead of who can be heard the most.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting idea. I am very frankly skeptical that it would work because at some point Americans stopped paying close attention to politics. You know, again, all of us pay close attention to politics, not everyone does. I am skeptical that people would, if this were a standard part of political campaigns, actually tune in to see the candidates debate. You know, in 1992, Ross Perot got blocks of time on network television, spent half an hour going through charts, and that actually worked. And part of it was the novelty, and part of it was that it was on prime time on, you know, network stations at a time when cable wasn't to the extent that it is now. I like the idea. It is sort of a classical sense of people being informed and making decisions based on it. I just don't know that in the modern world it's practical. And I think that political campaigns, part of what they spend a lot of time doing is figuring out how they get people who are generally disinterested to pay attention to what they're trying to say. And they know they have a very brief period of time in which to actually talk to people. And so they make their message as compact and compelling in that brief amount of time as they can, which often means that you get sort of rhetoric and pablum instead of, here are the 19 things that I plan to do with my campaign.
Peter in Texas, independent caller. Hi, Peter.
Yes, I was just asking for, you provided a statistic for votes in correlation to how much money you spent in the field, but what about a statistic as far as votes in correlation to how much you spent in media? And you said that how big of a role do you think media bias is taking a play into winning elections and whatnot? That's all I have to say.
Sure. It varies very widely. I mean, The field percentage is basically a rule of thumb. It depends on how many people you're able to contact, right? If there are, let's say there are 1,000 voters in a town, and you're able to knock on 100 doors, and you're able to convince 50 of those people to actually go out and vote. You can figure out the math there in terms of the effect that field had. And frankly, it's easier to study. You know, if you run a TV spot in that town, it's much harder to tell who you've influenced. You're not standing there asking them, okay, are you now likely to vote for my candidate because I just asked you to do so? So field is still a rule of thumb, but you're better able to actually gauge based on it. You can do polling. A lot of times what campaigns will do, particularly well-funded campaigns, is they will do polling of a particular area, then do a television spot, then re-poll it to get a sense of how effective that spot was. You know, absolutely, presidential campaigns do this, Senate campaigns do this. But most campaigns can't, and so as a general rule, it's also specific to that campaign, that moment, that ad.
What about getting voters to turn out the day of and spending money on that, micro-targeting, other types of technology that's used for that?
Sure. I mean, it is, especially in a close race, essential. You know, and one of the things that happened in the 2012 race, there's no question that President Obama was going to win based on what the actual outcome was. But one of the things that the Romney campaign had that they mark as a failure was the fact that their get out the vote tool didn't work effectively. And when you have a close race, your ability to know, you know, in a field campaign, what you do is over the course of the campaign, you identify this person said they are going to vote for us. And then on election day, your job is to make sure that person actually goes out and does so. Now, Republicans typically turn out more than Democrats do. And so this generally is something that the Democrats have focused more on, as get out the vote operation. But it can be very, very critical, and it is the most important part of doing field work. Jerry
in Baltimore, Democratic caller.
Thank you for taking my call. Thank you, C-SPAN. I wanted to know, I see all those numbers there, and, you know, I don't know about anybody else, but I see an untapped revenue source. Why can't we as citizens get a law or, you know, do a referendum on taxing those super PACs, political donations?
Right.
Hey, the Supreme Court said they're people too, and let them be taxed at 25% like me. Okay, I'm an hourly worker, independent, you know, sole proprietor, but still, you know, I'm the one that gets gouged the most. Look, I'm a Democrat. I give to the DSCC. God, you wouldn't believe how many emails I get. But, yeah, let them take 25 cents out of every dollar to, you know, pay the debt or go into the general fund. You know, Eric Cantor and the rest of them might see, you know, a little too more about, hey, let's get the house in order and not cut, because nobody's helping me with building up my business. Thank you.
Right. I think that it is extremely appealing in the abstract. I think that it would be, you know, I mean, part of what Citizens United determined was that these corporations have the right to be involved in political campaigns because it's an act of free speech. Therefore, what you're suggesting is essentially a tax on free speech, which I think is probably a non-starter both congressionally and from the judiciary. But secondarily, you know, this is money that that has already been taxed to whatever extent it has been taxed. You know, this is money that, let's say, the Koch brothers, which is an example that people like to cite, the Koch brothers, when they put money into a PAC, this is money that they've earned and already paid taxes on. Maybe it's capital gains taxes, so it's not the 25% that you're suggesting, but this is their own money in the same way that, like, if you took money from your savings account, if you give to the DSCC, if someone were to suggest that 25% of that should equivalently be taxed, maybe you'd be okay with that. I think a lot of people probably wouldn't.
Martha in Weaver, Alabama, Democratic caller, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Yes, I just heard, as far as taxing the contributions for political purposes, all money has been taxed. Whether you spend it at Walmart or anywhere else, why, it's already been taxed by somebody, but yet they pay tax on it. So why not tax the contributions? And another thing that I think should be done is the contributions should be put in a pot and divided equally, that no party could get more money than the other party. Now, that's my thought on the subject, and I sure appreciate you taking my call.
again, this is tricky. I mean, you know, the one thing to keep in mind is that all of these suggestions would have to go through Congress. Congress, as a general rule, is perfectly content with the campaign financing system. Certainly a majority of Congress is. The idea of putting it all into one big pool for the parties to share, I think, honestly, is a little unfair. I like it in theory, but it's easy to point out if you, for example, are a Republican and you were told, please give $100 to this campaign, by the way, 50 of it will go to my Democratic opponent, I think you'd probably be reticent to do so. And the only solution in that case is, you know, federal financing of elections or some other system. But I'm not sure that would have congressional support.
And Vicky's watching us in Alaska, Anchorage, Alaska, Republican caller.
Yes, I had a question regarding how is money spent to secure absentee votes for our men and women overseas? Thank you.
Sure. It's a very good question. And in my experience, I worked on political campaigns in California. And one of the things that we did is that there are publicly available lists of absentee voters. And so essentially, and especially as more and more states start adopting early voting or start adopting absentee-only voting as they have in the Pacific Northwest, this becomes more important. Frankly, from a campaign standpoint, it is much easier because as well as knowing who the absentee voters are, often you will get a list of people who have already voted. And that allows you to check them off your list of people that you need to reach out to. But essentially, it works the same way. You find out who the people are that need to vote, as well as you would finding out the people that live on a particular street, for example. You send them mail pieces. You advertise in places where you know they'll be watching. And then once they actually return their ballot and they've already voted, you take them off of your list.
Josh, here in D.C., independent caller.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I've been listening to your program, and I think it's a valid point that money raised obviously tends to result in elections. One, but I would suggest that that's not the main concern, because oftentimes money raised can connote support for the candidate. I think the concern comes about when the quid pro quo is a concern, where we're concerned that you give me money, I will vote your way. So I'm wondering what you think are some solutions. Professor Lawrence Lessig has suggested the idea of anonymous contributions and expenditures. I was wondering what you thought about that or other solutions available. Thank you.
It's a great question. And I wrote a piece earlier this month, maybe last month, that actually looked at that point, which is to what extent do campaign contributions actually buy votes? And again, another common misconception, frankly, is that Congress gets money from ExxonMobil, then votes for ExxonMobil. But really what those donors are doing is they're buying access to the politician. They're donating to events so they can go to the event and build a personal relationship. And there's an extent to which ExxonMobil, not to pick on them unnecessarily, but ExxonMobil, when it gives money to political candidates and goes to these campaign events, and their lobbyists get to meet the staffers, and their lobbyists get to, have dinner by paying $50,000, it builds a personal relationship. It gives them an opportunity to actually talk to elected officials, at which point they can make their case. Here's why it is important that we expand Alaska for more oil drilling. This is the most common manner, in my experience and what I've observed, of how that works. That it is basically just paying money to become friends, in essence. And I'm sorry, you had a second point, which has escaped me now.
You know what? We'll move on because we're running out of time. A couple emails here. Deborah says, why not just cut out the middlemen and pay me for my vote? And Mike in Colorado says, does the money gravitate to candidates who are winning?
Yes, to some extent it does. And that's a very good point, too. And it's a caveat that exists on the data, is that people who have more money to spend on political races and who are doing better in the polls and who get more media, all of that stuff helps contribute to the fundraising. And again, the data that we looked at was primarily money that looked at fundraising and looked at spending. We looked mostly at the spending side in an effort to try and move past that bias, because fundraising can be different from spending, and there are ways in which you can transfer funds over time. So yes, I think there is an effect in which the non-squeaky wheel gets the grease, to make up an idiom.
All right, Mr. Baum, liberal lefts, this is our final tweet. Our democracy is diminished when it comes to who can spend more on commercials rather than having to debate the issues. Thank you, Philip Bump, for joining us this morning. You can see his piece on theatlantic.com. And now the House is in session, live coverage here on C-SPAN.
13.